Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is our first time in this space, so I just wanted to give a shout out to the Chicago Architecture Center. We love this space. And I take it there's a few beer lovers in the house? Yeah. So we're going to try and work up a thirst for beer amongst you all with today's topic. And thrilled to have the Beer Summit be a part of the festival. And you know, we thrive through our partnerships, and that is the work of Liz Garibay. Well, actually, the work of both of you. The Brewseum is Liz's vision, and then the Beer Summit is the work of Theresa and Liz. And so, can you just give us a little bit? Let's start by talking about the Beer Summit, which is happening now. It kicked off yesterday. It runs through tomorrow. How you came up with this and how you two landed together working on it.
My background is in museums. I'm a museum professional first and foremost. Got my start as a 15-year-old intern at the Field Museum, and eventually went into academia and realized I was more of a museum person than an academic. But I found myself working in beer, and in those three areas, and really all areas of study, you have a conference, right? There's always professionals trying to get together, share information in wonderful ways. And so when I would go to this academic conference, or a museum conference, or a beer conference, all sharing incredible information, all sharing sometimes the same information over and over, meeting the same people, networking with the same people, and it's really positive in a lot of ways, but it's also very isolated. It's also very exclusive. So I really wanted to think about a way to look at topics that overlap all three of those fields of study and bring all those people together and create something for the general public. So the Beer Culture Summit is a mashup of an academic conference, a museum conference, a beer industry conference, and public programming. And gosh, when did we have that conversation? A year and a half ago?
Maybe, was it January of this year or last year?
No, it was last year for sure. So Theresa and I have been in contact she's doing amazing work, and we've been chatting for some time now. And she came to Chicago to do interviews for her oral history project, and I was fortunate enough to be one of those interviews. And at the end of the interview, we're chatting about a few things, and I kind of threw this idea out at her, and I was like, am I crazy for trying to do this Beer Culture Summit? And your reaction was awesome.
Yes, no, I mean, immediately it was incredibly appealing to me. My job at the American History Museum, which is a fantastic task, is to build a new archive of the histories of homebrewing and craft beer in the United States. And so we have collections at the American History Museum that are strong in late 19th century, early 20th century brewing history, brewing equipment, advertising, even sheet music. But there has not yet been a national scale scholarly effort to collect the histories of homebrewing and craft beer in the last 50 years. And so that is what I do there. And one pillar of that work is to travel around the country and to record oral histories for a new, a kind of archive of voices of all the people who are working in the industry today. And it started with brewers, but then as the longer I've been at the museum, the more that project has evolved to include all the many other kinds of people who are working to make this industry so incredibly dynamic. So that might be maltsters, writers, teachers. And when I knew I was coming to Chicago, I read a bit about the local beer scene. Liz's name was immediately one that seemed so innovative to me, and so traveling here, hearing her idea, I mean, it just seemed like an incredible opportunity to collaborate with her to bring many different kinds of people here to Chicago this weekend to think and drink beer.
Excellent. Well, so our topic today is what can we learn about history by looking through the lens of beer? And we're very fortunate because between Liz and Theresa, we basically have all of history covered because Liz covers everything up to the early 20th century, very early, turn of the 19th century.
Yeah, I don't really care about anything after 1900.
And Theresa is not only through this oral history project, which is documenting the current craft scene, is thinking about the 20th and 21st century. So we've got all of our bases covered. But I want to start, and we've decided that we're going to focus on 4 big topics to kind of narrow this, because we could be here all day. So we're going to talk about immigration, we're going to talk about politics, we're going to talk about industry/innovation, and then we're going to talk about advertising and marketing. And so kind of give you a glimpse of what those things look like when we look at them through the lens of beer and how we can learn more about our history. But can I mean, you've both staked your careers on this idea, so why should we look at history through beer?
Well, I do beer, but I also do alcohol, and the reason for it is because human beings have pretty much been drinking ever since we could walk. So making those connections is valid, it's real. Alcohol has often been a catalyst for a lot of things that human beings do. So for me...
Good and bad.
Absolutely. So it was definitely something that, for me, didn't make sense just to use as a narrative, but something that really sort of connected to me personally, because I'm a bar woman. I like sitting in bars. I like having conversations with people. The internet is, all amok today, and social media is everywhere, and my instant reaction is, can we just go have a beer at a bar, right? And so for me, that personal connection is incredibly important. Those spaces are incredibly important, and one of the things that I realized quickly was, when you have that beverage in front of you, right, suddenly all these barriers break down, and you're able to just have a face-to-face conversation. And the other thing is, when you ingest that wonderful elixir, right, that is alcohol or beer or wine or whatever you want to drink, when those inhibitions go down, all of a sudden, a variety of different information becomes more accessible. So it not only made sense to use alcohol as a narrative, but it made sense to use alcohol as a tool to connect us a little bit more.
And I was just going to slightly tweak the question for you, but feel free to take it wherever. If we're to think about what the last 50, 60 years of culture, history, which is your focus, is beer a really particularly interesting driving force?
Yes, it is. And so my focus on these movements of homebrewing and craft beer, they are fully interwoven with histories of do-it-yourself culture, the consumer movement, the countercultural movements. And so beer has this amazing interplay with social and cultural and political history, not just in the recent past, but in all eras. And so the National Museum of American History, of course, we collect the stuff of American life. And sometimes that's the really consequential, and sometimes it's the quotidian. So if you walk into the museum today in DC, you can see the ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz, or you can see the Post-it note on display, or you could see the original Star-Spangled Banner, and you can see a fondue pot. And so, it's all variety of things that we know from their time in the spotlight, the cultural political spotlight, but also things that we use every single day. And so beer straddles this world between, the really momentous moments in American history, but also the daily moments in our lives. And this talk comes at a great time because I have really exciting news to share, which is that yesterday, after more than 2 years of work, the food history exhibit at the museum, which if you've been there at any point, Julia Child's Kitchen is installed there. It was collected by a team of curators in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2001, brought down to DC, reinstalled in the museum, and you can see it there today. But we've refreshed the exhibit, and the curators there turned over a corner to me for beer. And so now there is a new section on the histories of homebrewing and microbrewing in these early years of what we now know as the craft beer revolution. It now has a home at the Smithsonian that you can see and visit the next time you go.
That's excellent. Awesome.
Keep drinking.
So let's talk about immigration first. But just, if you walk through Chicago, you can see so many vestiges of the history of beer in our city. You can see those corner taverns. You can see, maybe not see, but even in our legal system, the vestiges of Prohibition and what we can and cannot do, and all our zoning is infused with that era. But so immigrants are crucial to that kind of landscape in the city of Chicago and other cities. But just before we dive into, so what can we think, what do we know about, how do we see immigration when we look through the lens of beer? Beer predates anyone coming to this country, right? So can you both talk about that a little bit?
I always like to talk about this in the context that one question we often get as women in beer is, how do you feel about beer being such a male-dominated field? And I'm like, well, the first brewers were actually women. They're called Brewsters. So women have sort of been at the forefront of beer making. We know that it started in Turkey area, some beginnings in Egypt, and one of the panels for the Beer Culture Summit, the very first one, was scholars from all over the country looking at different periods of time in beer, and we just called it Beer, It's Really Old. Because beer is really old. Definitely not the first beverage. Mead was the first beverage, but later on beer. And so, again, it's been one of those things that's been around for quite a long time and influencing civilization for quite a long time.
And then in the United States, Theresa, do you want to say anything about the sort of, so how much was beer a part of this country even before we had immigration?
Right. So before European colonists arrived on this continent, indigenous communities, primarily in the Southwest, they were brewing fermented beverages from things like corn, from palms, and from other fruits and vegetables in the region. But then the first professional brewery on this continent was founded in 1612 on the tip of Manhattan Island by two Dutchmen. So we tend to associate beer in this country with German immigrants, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a moment. But the first professional brewery was at the hands of Dutchmen. And then English colonists who arrived primarily beginning in the 17th century, they brought ale brewing styles to this country. And as Liz said, it is a very historically recent phenomenon for beer to be associated with men, that really up until 1850, beer was something that was made by women. It was consumed by men, women, and children. And it was something that was brewed in the home. It was a domestic task, much like baking bread. And so what we see and feel related to beer and who drinks it, where it's drunk, these are all really factors of our relatively recent history.
So let's talk about immigration and some stories of beer and immigration. Who wants to, Liz, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Should we talk about Chicago since we're here? Let's focus on hometown. So our city's history from the very beginning, we've been drinking. It's sort of part of our DNA to be these social drinkers. The very first story, well, of course, we always begin with Native American stories here in the Chicagoland area, and then move into, we get some British influence, of course, because we're a British country. Fort Dearborn has some British soldiers who stay behind and become then American. At that point in time, soldiers at Fort Dearborn were given a pitiful salary. It was a really tough job, and they were given rations of four things. Four things that the United States government felt you needed to keep you happy. Flour, salt, soap, gotta stay clean, and whiskey. Right? And these soldiers were given these four rations of things, and they could take their pitiful salary and buy more of it. And who's here has heard of John Kinsey? John Kinsey was one of the early settlers in the city of Chicago, and John Kinsey made whiskey at home. He also had a store. So you could go to John Kinsey's store, and you could buy all of those things, and the soldiers, lo and behold, actually ended up buying more whiskey than anything, right? So John Kinsey invents something that no one's ever done before. He invents something called a line of credit, right? Because he wanted to sell more. Anyway, whiskey is very much part of the beginnings of this land prior to us actually becoming an actual city. So if you think about immigration, it's really about these British soldiers coming in, this new sort of group of people creating the area and drinking whiskey. There was a little bit of ales, porters, stouts, right? As Theresa said, British-style beers that were mostly imported, so expensive. And if you think about beer, right, it's a living thing, so it has a shelf life. It doesn't really last that long. So hard alcohol is really what keeps us happy at first. And that was around at that point in time in early Chicago in the 1800s. But by the 1820s, we get our real first wave of immigrants, and those are Germans. If you think about what's happening in the United States during the early 1800s, you're starting to get all kinds of immigrants coming through the East Coast, right? So the East Coast starts becoming densely populated. 1803, Louisiana Purchase. Pretty much doubles the size of the new United States. And our location right here, right behind us, right where Fort Dearborn was, on Wacker in Michigan, becomes this sort of watchdog area, which is why Fort Dearborn goes in. And so this area is growing and growing and growing. The middle of the country is growing. Government says, hey, everybody on the East Coast, keep moving. There's stuff, we promise. And if you think about the immigrants who are coming to the United States, all kinds of different backgrounds. The Germans coming, a little bit educated, have a little bit of money, versus, say, the Irish, right? Complete opposite. Not very well educated, don't have a lot of money. And other immigrant groups fall into that too. So it's the Germans who actually have the capacity to keep moving west. And so if you think about where we are, right? Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Cleveland, we all have a very strong shared German heritage. And of course, those Germans are bringing their skill sets, lucky us. And so beer making starts in Chicago officially in 1835 with the very first brewery. So that's just one teeny example of how immigration and the beer industry and our city's history and our country's history really all sort of grow up together in a way. And it just, that pattern keeps happening throughout the course of our past.
So, and this is a story it's so strong in our American history, not just our beer history, to think again about Germans in relation to beer, but I think it's a mistake also to think of immigrants as purely part of America's beer history. There's so much part of America's beer present as well. And so in my travels throughout the country and recording these oral histories, I've met with several people who are themselves immigrants or refugees or the sons of immigrants, sons in this case, who are running breweries. And so just for example, when you think of Asheville, North Carolina, they have a booming craft beer scene. Turns out the first craft brewery in Asheville was founded by an immigrant, Oscar Wong, whose family is Chinese. He grew up in Jamaica. He moved to the United States to study engineering at Notre Dame, had a full career as an engineer, and then started a brewery in 1994 in Asheville as a hobby. And so Oscar Wong initiated the craft beer movement in Asheville. On Bowie in Richmond, Virginia, he came to the United States as a refugee from the Vietnam War with his family in the mid-1980s, landed in Richmond through a connection with the Catholic Church. As he was growing up, his family opened a Vietnamese restaurant in Richmond called Mekong, and he went to hotel management school. And in seeking to kind of upscale the dining experience at this Vietnamese restaurant, he started a really innovative Belgian beer menu at this restaurant in Richmond. This was in the mid-1990s. That got him really into beer, and he expanded his menu and his portfolio to become a brew pub owner in Richmond, and again started this kind of nascent craft beer movement in Richmond. Last week I was in Minneapolis. I met with Omar Ansari, who founded Surly Brewing Company. We met at his brewery's original location in the northern part of the city, and he said, this is a second generation small business. And he pointed to this sign up on the wall, and his father was an immigrant from Pakistan. He ran an industrial abrasives company where Omar worked when he was just out of college. And as the years passed, the abrasives company was starting to decline a bit, and the family decided together that Omar could take over the space and turn it into a brewery. And so I think you have these amazing stories that are all over the country if you look, and immigrants will certainly be part of the future of American beer too.
I'm curious if beer in the larger story of immigration is it a story of economic opportunity as you come to a new country? Is it a story of connecting to tradition and culture and the places that you've left behind? Some of both. Is it a way of integrating and assimilating, or is it a way of maintaining distinction? I mean, what do you find as you kind of look broadly?
I think it's a little bit of everything. If you're foreign, new to a country, obviously you find a job in something that you know how to do, right? So for our story, for Chicago, in the middle of our country, and certainly part of our country, Germans are coming, again, with their skill sets. And the very first Germans actually weren't even making German-style beers that you know of, right? Lagers and things. They were actually making, in Chicago, certainly the very first German brewery was making ales and porters because that's what the market wanted, right? And so they're doing things they know how to do, but they're also catering to the audience. So that's assimilation, right? That's trying to find economic opportunity. And that's really also trying to do what you know. Taverns play into this, of course, because in all over the country, we see these ethnic taverns, right? And so you might create a space for people who look like you, act like you, speak like you, understand you, so you wouldn't drink together, right? So these ethnic taverns also start to become a little way for people to just sort of carve out their own space, and while you're assimilating, also be comfortable in your own skin and in your new home.
And I just want to second this point about just how important saloons and taverns were at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century for not just meeting people from maybe your own region who spoke your language, but figuring out how to integrate yourself into the political system in America, figuring out maybe where you want to live, maybe where you want to work. And this might veer into the realm of politics, but it was the heavily immigrant nature of saloons that became such a point of anxiety for a lot of Americans as Prohibition approached. Many scholars are starting to think or have found that the advent of Prohibition came not so much because Americans wanted to shun alcohol, it was because many Americans wanted to control the social culture of immigrants, and that they saw saloons as these sites of purportedly very un-American social disorder, of corruption, and so cracking down on saloons rather than the consumption of alcohol was a way to get at that.
Well, and there's some truth to that, right? In the sense that, that the way you started talking about taverns as gathering places and exchanging ideas, and certainly they're places where you can kind of form, collectives at work, or advocate for the changes in the conditions of life and things like that.
Yeah, and you don't even, we still do that today, right? We all have that local bar that we all love to go to, right? You're a regular, maybe somewhere, maybe more than one place. And it's nice to be able to walk into a bar by yourself and where everybody knows your name, right? And so you want to be with people who get you. I don't know if you guys, I always tease my sister about this, but I have a bar family, and sometimes I like them way more than my actual family, right? It's because it's a different little dynamic there. And so taverns in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and 21st century, right, become these incredibly important places where people come together. And obviously they function in very different ways in different periods of time. 19th century, I like calling these taverns the original Facebook. It's where you go in and you exchange information and you get gossip, and you maybe see later on when photographic technology comes out, maybe baby pictures. It's where you find someone a job who's coming to the new country. So it's this incredible space where things happen. Information is just, particular to that time period, but that still exists today. So the importance of saloons in American culture, for sure, in American history, is incredibly essential to who we are as Americans.
And then in terms of American politics, so, Haymarket, right, for example, here in Chicago has a link to saloons, but how should we think about the nature of our politics through the lens of beer, alcohol? Obviously Prohibition is a great big, marker in that history. So what would you say about that, or about other moments that we should be thinking about?
Well, and I'm thinking almost about alcohol through the lens of politics in a way, and whether alcohol is available to us and what formats, where we can get it, has always been the fruit of politics. And so, as you mentioned, Prohibition is this momentous event in our history, the history of beer, the history of a nation. And so, from 1920 to 1933, the federal government outlawed the production, transportation, and sale of intoxicating beverages, not the consumption of intoxicating beverages, which meant that Prohibition had very different effects depending on your social class. If you were of an upper crust, then if you could see what was coming, you could stock your cellar with what you like to drink, have a fairly good time during the dry years. If you were of a lower socioeconomic class, that meant you were likely trying to distill your own spirits or reach for alcohol that was perhaps not of the best quality. But even after Prohibition's repeal, home brewing remained illegal until 1978. Its repeal went into effect in 1979. Home brewing was still illegal in Mississippi and Alabama until 2013. And the effect of Prohibition's repeal, the federal government left it to the states to figure out how to repeal Prohibition in each state. And so where you can buy alcohol in your state, if there are restrictions on a particular day, particular time, if you're buying it from a state liquor store versus an independent store, that's all completely related to how Prohibition was repealed.
I'm going to go back into my comfort zone of the 1800s.
It's all right.
I know, living in the past. Politics in Chicago, day one, just the way we've been drinking, right? Anyone ever heard of a man named William Ogden, right? William Ogden, again, another early Chicago settler, our city's very first mayor. William Ogden was obsessed with hops in the hop industry in the United States in the early 1800s. He was also an investor in our very first brewery. And when he went up for election against John Kinsey, by the way, John Kinsey never got over that one. John Kinsey lost to William Ogden. William Ogden immediately saw some opportunities to grow the city and grow the brewing industry, but then took a couple of steps back and said, I don't think this is going to mix. Can you imagine that? A mayor actually saying, I don't want to do this. So he kind of takes a step back and focuses his way into politics. So that's just one little snippet, right? Another little great example is going back into 1855. Again, this is one of those moments where immigration and politics intersect here. In the mid-1850s, we have in our nation a very anti-immigrant political party. History repeats itself, by the way. So the American Party is very much rooted in their anti-immigrant positions. And in Chicago, we have an American Party mayor named Levy Boone, who is the great-great-grandnephew of Daniel Boone, right? So he's feeling authentically, genuinely American, and these immigrants need to go away. So we're in a period of major brewing in Chicago, major taverns, tavern life and culture, and so a lot of these immigrants are able to find jobs and opportunities in these industries, right? In Chicago, it's really easy to get a liquor license, go figure. So all you would need to do is really find 4 walls, a roof, and some booze. Instant bar. And so that provided a lot of opportunity for people who maybe didn't have any other option. So he goes after the alcohol industry, right? The way to get to the immigrants was to go after their booze. And Germans were certainly a target. So he does 2 things. One is he makes it illegal for bars to be open on Sundays. This is a time when people are working 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. I don't know about you guys, but on my day off, might want to take a drink or 2. The other thing he does is he raises liquor license fees from $50 per year to $300 per quarter. Can't manage it. So what happens is bar owners who chose to stay open because they weren't going to go for this end up getting arrested. And in April 21st, 1855, there's a trial for these saloon owners. And what happens is the German community, the Irish community, the Polish community, the Italian community, all these different immigrant communities who had never really had a voice decide to organize, and they basically decide to storm City Hall and get that dude, right? And so they go after him. It's a whole tumultuous event that happens. And they get to City Hall and punches are thrown, shots are fired, 1 man dies, and Levy Boone's advisors say, don't do that. I don't think that's a bad idea. So he doesn't change the law. So good guys win temporarily. But the more important thing here is that the next year, Levy Boone is up for re-election. Those immigrant groups stay organized. They'd never gone to vote before that. And they stay organized to go vote again and actually have their voice, right? Levy does not get reelected. So 2 major things for me in that moment of 1855. It's called the 1855 Lager beer riots, by the way, because lager beer is what people are drinking. So it's really about people's freedom to drink where and when they want to and what they want to. But the other thing is that it's the city's first moment of civil unrest, right? All rooted on alcohol. And for me, the most important thing out of all of this is that following year when everybody goes to the polls and votes him out. So for me, the 1855 Lager Beer Riot is not only Chicago's first moment of civil unrest, but it's the event that actually gives us our identity as a political machine, right? And so that really kind of all of a sudden, all these German brewers, by the way, the Germans were really ticked off because German festive culture was just who they were, right? So going after their drink, going after their want to play music while they're drinking and sing or maybe parade was to go after their very identity. So this was a no-no. So this was a major moment. And so this politics and immigration thing really go hand in hand. And by the way, a lot of the brewers, the immigrant brewers and the immigrant tavern owners started to get really heavily involved in politics. They actually started running for office. So this is a constant sort of battle that happens through the 19th century.
As you're saying, it's kind of the topic of politics and immigration come together in the lager beer riot, as does industry, right? Because it's an attack on industry and the way industry operates. And so I wanted to, before we go to Q&A, talk a little bit about industry, innovation, and advertising and marketing, and sort of what we can talk about in terms of the current scene, but also the historic scene, how beer and alcohol have shaped those.
Okay. So if you're curious about industry innovation with respect to microbrewing and craft beer, when I talk about microbrewing, so following Prohibition's repeal, you have this story of a consolidating beer industry throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The breweries that were able to survive Prohibition, they were the biggest breweries, that makes sense. They were able to wait out the dry years by redirecting their production to things like soft drinks or chocolate or even ceramics in the case of Coors out in Colorado. So they were ready to brew beer again after Prohibition was repealed. But then over the ensuing decades, those breweries consolidated and they started to make a narrower and narrower stylistic assortment of beers until essentially it was just light-bodied lagers that were being made in this country in the 1960s, 1970s. So some brewers, especially home brewers who were brewing illegally, they were just bored. They were bored with what was available on the shelves, and so they went abroad often for military service in the mid-20th century or for educational purposes to places like Belgium and England and Germany, even Scotland, and they were just completely inspired by all these different styles of beers that they found overseas, and so they bought homebrewing manuals, homebrewing equipment. They brought them back to the United States, and so it's a little difficult for us to appreciate now how completely innovative it was to try to brew at a small scale in a country that was completely dominated by huge beer. The kind of nadir of the American brewing industry in terms of the number of breweries was 1978. We had the fewest number of breweries in 1978, and so when the very first microbrewers who started in California in the mid-1960s, mid-1970s, when they first opened, it wasn't just about trying to brew beer at a small scale. It was all of the different things that they had to do in order to do that. And so they had to find ingredients that were available to them at a small scale. They had to figure out how to construct customer bases for people who had never tasted a porter or what we would come to know as a pale ale. That was not part of the American beer palette at the time. How to advertise to customers, how to get financing for those to run their breweries. And so every single component of running a business at a small scale was innovative. And I'll mention one particular innovation that, again, we might take for granted today, but if you are a beer drinker, especially a craft beer drinker, and you have an IPA, and it tastes kind of citrusy or piney, you're tasting hops, of course, and you are very likely tasting a particular American strain of hops, Cascade Hops, which were developed on the West Coast in the mid-1970s in collaboration between the USDA and Oregon State University. But craft brewers, when they were searching for ingredients, this new strain of Cascade Hops was something that was just available to them. It was not being used by big breweries at the time, and so small brewers like Jack McAuliffe at New Albion Brewing Company, Ken Grossman at Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, they said, yeah, I'll try this new kind of hops, Cascade hops, and these hops ended up developing, coming to define the taste for American beer, and really excited this thirst for bitterness in beer among even a global beer drinker.
I'm curious, just to come back to Prohibition for a minute, and your comments now about the American beer palate and the way that in our moment it's evolved. I guess, Michael Pollan was with the festival earlier this year, and he was talking about the history of LSD, and even when LSD was, made illegal, it didn't, there's this whole kind of hidden history of how there kept being experimentation with it because there was all this promise with the drug and the things that it could do. And I guess I'm curious whether you see that innovation continued despite Prohibition, or did Prohibition effectively so shut off the American beer palate and industry that it affected it kind of irreparably in a way? I mean, obviously we have one, but you know what I mean? Like people had to go elsewhere to kind of rediscover that rich beer culture to bring it back.
I would say to that point that it was very much detrimental because, and that's for a few different reasons, that it's very difficult to brew beer cleanly at home, especially if you don't have mechanical refrigeration. And so it's not, you simply cannot brew in the 1920s many different styles of beer safely at home in consistent quantities. Another piece of the Prohibition history is that many saloons during Prohibition, they converted to soda parlors. And so this new wave of sweet sodas, of ice cream drinks, scholars think that actually the American palate came to really desire sweetness during Prohibition in a way that it had not before. And so it's very true that a generation of people came to drinking age during Prohibition having a taste for Coca-Cola, for ice cream floats, and then when they came of age and had light-bodied lagers, that seemed appropriate to them, that they liked the taste of that. And it was not until a later point in time that Americans came to want beers that were malty or bitter.
People have asked me to curate a Prohibition-era dinner, and I say, you want Spam and sweet things? Okay. I think a lot of the innovation really happened for us in the United States in the late 19th century. Teresa's 100% on point. Prohibition, after that, it's sort of like that's not even really important anymore. All the processing that's happened, right? We're in a post-war time, and also post-Prohibition, it's really also post-Depression, right? Getting out of that. And so there are all these other things that I think become a little bit more, I guess, priority. And there's going to be beer, right? You're going to drink whatever is there, but there's other sort of areas of focus to focus on. So a lot of our innovation really happens in the late 19th century in the United States, and that's really, again, with the onset of refrigeration. Prior to refrigeration, the brewers, anyone ever been up to Miller Brewing Company in Milwaukee? One of the things that you'll see up there is caves, right? Cellaring caves. And Frederick Miller chose that location because of those caves. So what they would actually do is go out to the Lake Michigan, harvest ice, throw them in the cellars, and that's how you could make really cold beer, really cold lager. And actually make lager, right? And so a lot of this innovation that happens in the United States is really focused on refrigeration. Chicago is a leading place for architecture. Not just for the built environment as a whole, but for brewing architecture. Most of the breweries in the United States were designed by Chicago architects during the 19th century, around the country, around the nation. There's also an assortment of different sort of technologies that come about. We have the oldest brewing school in the country here in Chicago. It's called Siebel. Technically started in 1872, so the year after our big fire of 1871. And what Siebel does is he starts introducing more sort of local American ingredients into beer. So if you're thinking about these German traditions, right, you're bringing all of these different kinds of grains that are traditionally making these historic style beers. But in the late 19th century, what Siebel does is he starts introducing things like rice and corn into beer, right? So if you're actually ever drinking a Bud product, you're drinking a rice beer. If you're ever drinking a Miller product, you're drinking a corn beer. And what we're doing is we're adding these new ingredients. So he creates a whole new style of beer called Adjunct Lagers. And this becomes an American beer. This is what we drink today. So a lot of that innovation really happens for us in the late 19th century. And I think it really is kind of stunted until the 60s.
We're going to talk about advertising and marketing too, but I just want to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions, and then maybe we'll try to end with some of that. So we're going to move to question and answer now, and Cameron and Alison have microphones, so take it away, you guys.
All right, that would be great. Just try to be as brief as possible so we can get to as many people as we can, and just try to make sure that your question is phrased as a question. So, who can I bring this to first?
Have a hand up here.
Great.
Thanks for being here. My question is, if brewing was originally a female-centric activity, what is the current climate now for female brewers? Because you don't see very many, do you?
That's right. It's a heavily male industry in terms of producers and consumers. There are organizations like the Pink Boots Society, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to providing educational scholarships to encourage women in the industry. There are other organizations like the Barley's Angels, which are dedicated to encouraging women's appreciation of beer. And you know, there's been a lot of reporting in the industry about misogyny on the brewery floor, label art and beer names that are not welcoming to women consumers, and you could have a similar conversation about ethnic and racial diversity in beer. And you know, it's an industry again that used to be incredibly diverse along all indexes, evolved into something that is not the case at the moment, but is improving along certain measures. And this question is very much a topic of conversation in the industry, which is the first step to changing things. But I don't know if you want to.
No, that's good.
Well, and I mean, just for advertising and marketing, I mean, the tension, because women are the biggest consumer, right? They make most of the consumption decisions, and so even if they're not consuming the beer, they may be buying it. And so this is an industry aimed at men, but it's also women who are kind of...
Yeah, I'm curious if that is still the case, because definitely after Prohibition's repeal, the beer industry very much knew that women were the ones who would buy the beer. And so, you know, if I look at trade literature from the 1930s, I can see advertisements for the design of six-pack containers, and they say, you know, the companies that are producing these six-packs, they are thinking of appealing to the woman of the house who's walking down the supermarket aisle, you know, have her pick up this six-pack of beer, but the assumption is that she's bringing it home so the man of the house can drink it at home. You know, that even at that point in time, the industry is not assuming that women are drinking the beer. And so,
those fools. Other questions?
I was just wondering about the growth of refrigeration technology and how the bigger breweries pushed out a lot of the small ones, started acquiring them. Is it just coincidental that those ones, Budweiser, Miller, Schlitz, whatever, were brewing a sort of more sort of anodyne, not great tasting maybe beer? Were there other small breweries around at that time in the 50s and 60s that were making interesting beers?
Well, and I think one important point to make is when you talk about adjunct lagers, so beers that are made with rice and corn, you know, now they have a really bad rap, but it's more than 7 out of 10 beers that are sold today in the United States still fall under that category. Brewers started to make those beers because that's what customers wanted. They wanted beers that were super light and clean and just felt fresh and uncomplicated. And so they did that in response to consumer demand. And so certainly as breweries like Anheuser-Busch and Miller and Coors got bigger and bigger, of course they had more resources to invest in refrigerated trucks and refrigerated rail cars and bigger facilities. And so, you know, I think it's almost kind of like a kind of snowball effect that as the biggest breweries got going, they just kind of started to eat up, you know, all the competition. But certainly in the 1800s, there was a history of, you know, very small local breweries that were serving super local customer bases, and they were brewing a kind of greater ethnic style of beer from Europe. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. With InBev and Miller Coors consolidating all the craft breweries underneath their banners, are we facing another possibility of reaching another nadir in brewing where they take over all these craft beers, maybe let them make their own beers for a while, but then phase stuff out?
I mean, that's a great question about the bubble, and I ask that to brewers when I visit them. They say, well, I want to know what you know when you talk to from all the other brewers that you've talked to. I mean, it's certainly, you know, we're at a super interesting point in the beer industry to study, to be a consumer in, and this is partly because there's been an incredible growth in very small breweries recently, but the overall rate of beer consumption in the country has remained fairly flat. So that means who's getting gnawed at? It's the regional level of breweries who are really feeling pressure from below as well as from above. And then you have the very big brands who are seeing craft breweries as the way to freshen up their portfolio. And so there's a lot of, you know, it's this kind of cultural tension within the craft beer business that, you know, seeing other breweries as selling out, as being kind of traitorous if they sign for, you know, a deal with AB InBev, and so it's a kind of it's a conflict that's personal as well as economic. But interestingly, I think when you see this growth in the very small breweries, it's almost a turn back to a pre-prohibition model of brewing, that there are breweries that say it's going to be most profitable for me to never package my beer in cans or bottles, that it's going to be most profitable for me to have one tap room, maybe two tap rooms, to shoot for really local consumers who are going to come back here and make this tap room their local, and never actually shoot higher than that. And so it's a really interesting growth in the diversity of very small producers now.
Has anyone ever been to Peace Pizzeria and Brewery? That's an amazing model. Peace started in 2001 with one goal: to make beer for the restaurant, and that's it. And they are the winningest brewery in the city of Chicago for the Great American Beer Festival, for the World Beer Cup, because they really focus on that place only. They don't package, they don't do anything else. And so it's been one of the most successful breweries in the city, one of the most long-lasting breweries in the city, because they see, that's a great margin for them.
Yeah, we used to talk about microbreweries, right? And there's like what you're describing is sort of that return to that kind of idea. I saw hands. There's back here.
Hi. So I used to live in New York, where beer cannot be sold in the same place as wine and liquor, but beer is sold at every corner bodega, versus Chicago, where you can buy hard liquor at 7-Eleven. I was wondering how that separation of beer to other alcohols came about, how it impacts different cultures having that.
I would certainly say it's related to how Prohibition was repealed in the state of New York. And when I talk to many brewers, this goes back to the politics question, many craft brewers who were early figures in their state found themselves involved in politics because they had to work with legislators to make it legal to sell beer brewed on site. And so Uli Benowitz, for example, another immigrant brewer from Germany who came to North Carolina in the 1980s, he had to work with legislators to change laws to make tap rooms legal in North Carolina. But that's an effort that has had to be repeated in every single state by a lot of microbrewers or craft brewers. And a lot of these regulations related to the sale of alcohol, consumption of alcohol, it's all related to these early, older laws.
Yeah, and some of these laws actually even predate Prohibition. When I was living in Boston, I remember, I think like week 2 of living in Boston, I walked from my apartment to a liquor store on a Sunday and it's closed, and I'm like, what? I'm thinking about where I am, and I'm like, oh, Puritans, and it was baffling to me that I couldn't buy alcohol at a grocery store. I had to go to a liquor store, and then it was closed on Sundays. So a lot of these laws actually still exist in these crazy places.
Some of the historical European styles were very dependent on water and the type of water that was available to the brewers. In the U.S., had the chemistry already taken over that, or was there a time when water and the local water had a big impact?
We are fortunate in the middle of the country to have 5 wonderful fresh Great Lakes that added to, obviously water is one of the ingredients in beer. It's mostly water, if you think about it. But then there are certain situations where human beings screw things up, right? So in Chicago, for example, that river behind the Chicago River was a giant cesspool of human waste, animal waste, industrial waste. And of course, before we miraculously reversed the flow of the Chicago River, everything flowed into Lake Michigan and caused a lot of disease. And obviously that ends up affecting our drinking water. But then of course, for beer, you boil it, right? And so that's just one little baby example of water playing a role in beer through time. But then also, there's different chemistries to it. Certainly, it's not just with beer, right? If anyone likes New York style pizza, you have to have New York water to make New York style pizza. An example that I also like with beer, though, is Lagunitas Brewing Company, started in Northern California by a Chicagoan who, as the brewery was growing in Northern California, was expanding and growing. And by the time Tony realized that shipping costs to, say, Florida were ridiculously expensive and it was going to be cheaper for him to open a second brewery, he decided to open a second brewery in Chicago, his hometown. And Lagunitas IPA, of course, is their flagship and one that really kind of created the brewery. And when they started making beer, their IPA with Lake Michigan water, the brewers started trying to take these taste tests and realized that the Chicago IPA was actually better, so they actually adjusted their California recipe to match the water pH here in Chicago. So it's sort of something that has happened in the past and certainly is ever present today.
We got one more question.
With the long immigrant history of beer, was there ever a point in time where one style of beer was seen as just more desirable because the other immigrant group wasn't liked or anything of the sort?
That's a loaded question for many reasons. So lagers, people weren't drinking lagers prior to the 1850s. One, because we didn't have the technology. The lager yeast was not available yet in the United States. When lagers did appear, it was still sort of this foreign brew, right? What is this weird stuff that you weird people are drinking? But then if you've ever had a stout on a 90-degree Chicago day, sure, okay, I'm not going to judge you for drinking that, but then drink a lager, right, a cold lager, and it's like the heavens part and the angels sing. So, and as the Germans are also starting to also assimilate, right, into becoming not just German, but German American, people are starting to be more open to their styles of beer. And so that's really when the German beer lagers sort of start to really kind of take over, and lager is king for most of the 19th century. But then you remember in the 20th century, early 20th century, we have a war. We have a couple wars. In Germany, not a good idea to sort of, like German things, especially beer. And so people sort of make shifts based on what's happening in the world around us, right? Everything that happens in our backyard or across the ocean is always going to affect what your choices sort of are and how you appear to the outside world. And so beer is certainly a giant part of that.
We talked earlier today at the summit too about how World War I was this important moment when brewers previous to the war had been very happy to be German, to do their business in German, to have their beer taste German. But suddenly with the advent of the war, they wanted to show that they were American, and so that they actually changed the ethnic nature of their beer rather than the beer itself to be more American.
Well, so before I let you guys go, I let you both go after a great conversation. So I met Liz because I used to co-host a craft beer podcast called Strange Brews, which was about the craft and culture around beer. And that's how I knew about your appointment, Theresa, when you were, it's almost 3 years now, right, that you were appointed at the Smithsonian. And one of the ways that we always started that podcast was to ask our guests, what are you drinking? So before you go, tell us what you're drinking.
I'm not just saying this because I helped make this beer, but it's literally the last thing I consumed. The Chicago Brewseum opened an exhibition at the Field Museum a year ago. It's been up for a year now. And the Field Museum has been making beers for some time with different breweries around town. And so part of that evolution of that relationship with the Field Museum and that exhibition is the Field Museum really doing something remarkable and saying, the next beer we want to make, we also want it to be a cultural collaboration with you guys. And so we consulted on that, and so we made a beer rooted in the history of the beer industry during the 1893 World's Fair. It's a cream ale brewed by Temperance Beer Company, and it's called All the World is Here, because that was one of the slogans of the 1893 World's Fair, and that is literally the last thing that touched my lips.
And I'm asked this question a lot to the point where if before I have an interview, I'll look in my fridge so I can remind myself what beers are in my fridge, because people are always like, what are you drinking right now? What's your favorite? And I often try to be diplomatic and say, oh, beer is regional and seasonal. And you're like, yeah, what's your favorite beer? Like, what are you drinking right now? So a beer, a six-pack I picked up recently. I love everything that Bell's does. Bell's out of Michigan. And so they are doing a really cool series based on Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And this is a 7-part series. And so part 2 is called Prairie Grass Dividing, and it's a slightly tart Goza-style ale with plum and coriander and salt, and it's delicious.
Oh, that sounds amazing. If you weren't thirsty before, you certainly are now. And so there is actually, you can go anywhere and get a beer right now, but Liz, you're hosting, you're having a reception tonight. Can you just tell us a little bit about it, if any of you want to go?
Yeah, if you guys are thirsty after this. So the Beer Culture Summit really has an array of different subject matters that we're approaching. And tonight, what we're doing at Kaiser Tiger in the West Loop, we're hosting a discussion called For the Love of Beer, which is 4 couples in the brewing industry from very different perspectives, talking about their journey in beer together and how, just a variety of different topics in the craft beer industry. But it's really going to be a fun, lighthearted, maybe we'll get some gossip, I don't know, conversation with some food and some beverages. And then, of course, the summit continues tomorrow all throughout the city, looking more at some historic legacy brands and historic beers and conversations and all kinds of things.
Well, next time we gather to talk about beer history, we can put love on the agenda.
Love.
What do we know about love through beer? Liz Garibay, Theresa McCulla, thank you both so much
Thanks,
for being
Alison.
here with
Thank you
us
very much.
today.